When the flight attendant called her Mrs. Monroe, I didn't correct her because I wanted to see how far my husband would lie with me standing right there. Before I tell you what happened next, just know, this story doesn't end the way you think it does. If you've ever second-guessed your own eyes, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. You're not crazy. Neil had packed my carry-on himself, neatly folded the silk blouse I always saved for vacation dinners, tucked the charger in the front pouch, even remembered the migraine patch I always forget. It was thoughtful, but I should have known Neil is always thoughtful when he's about to disappear. At the gate, he was already on a call, nodding at nothing, mouthing, "Go ahead," when I hesitated to board without him. I scanned my boarding pass expecting 2A, maybe 2B if he wanted the window this time, but when the screen blinked red and the agent said, "Oh," my stomach folded into itself. "I think you're in the wrong cabin," the agent said, voice hushed but not unkind, like maybe I was someone's assistant who'd wandered up too far. She checked again, printed something, handed me a new slip with an apologetic smile. "You're in 18C economy." I looked back at Neil, still deep in pretend conversation, not even glancing up. "No worries," I smiled tightly, stepping aside for a man in a press suit behind me, who had the kind of confidence people who always fly first class carry in their posture. I didn't understand it yet, but something had shifted. I walked down the jet bridge slower than usual, dragging time, heart thudding against my ribs, as if my body already knew what I didn't want to know. I paused at the curtain separating business from the rest, those heavy fabric dividers that feel like they belong in a play, not a plane. Just a few rows ahead, I saw Neil. And I saw her. Blonde, soft-voiced, legs crossed toward him, laughing at something only they could hear. She was in 2A. My seat. He was in 2B, leaned in close. She wasn't startled when I appeared. She looked curious. "Oh," she said, not startled, just slightly amused, like I was a waitress showing up at the wrong table. "Is this your wife?" That word hit harder than I expected, like it had become someone else's name while I wasn't paying attention. Neil shifted in his seat, finally noticing me, and stood too quickly, voice calm, hands up like I was a threat. "Liz, there must have been a mix-up." "You're in the other cabin," he said, like I was the problem to solve, not the lie sitting beside him. "It's okay," I said, though it wasn't. "Just enjoy the flight." The flight attendant, Clara, her name tag said, watched the whole thing. She didn't look surprised. Her eyes followed me back down the aisle, all the way to 18C, where I squeezed between a teenager with headphones and a man who smelled faintly of whiskey. I stared at the sea back in front of me, knees to my chest, arms folded tight, like I could hold my questions in if I pressed hard enough. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just replayed the way the woman smiled at Neil, the way he didn't correct her, the way I disappeared in real time. 2 hours in, Clara came to my seat with water and a small napkin folded into a triangle. "He's flown with her before," she said softly, crouched beside me like we were allies. I wasn't supposed to say that. She slipped something into my lap and walked away. It was a duplicate itinerary, 2 tickets, Neil Monroe and Rhea Lawson, business class, round trip. Booked 3 weeks ago. I stared at the names, memorized the times, noted the return flight date. It was 3 days after our anniversary. That night he told me he had to fly last minute for a client crisis. When we landed, I didn't say anything. Neil met me at the baggage carousel like he'd just seen me 10 minutes ago. He asked if I slept, told me the hotel had been upgraded too. "They bumped us to the corner suite," he said, unlocking his phone. I watched his screen light up with a message from Rhea. "Told you she'd buy it." He turned the screen just fast enough that he thought I missed it. I didn't speak. I didn't touch my bag. I just looked at him, his practiced smile, his easy voice, and knew I wasn't the one being upgraded anymore. That night in the hotel, I unpacked slowly, touching each item like it belonged to someone else. Neil ordered room service, picked at his food, made small talk about the city, the view, the spa package. He didn't ask how I was, and I didn't offer it. The silence between us was thick, but familiar. It wasn't the first time I'd felt alone beside him, just the first time I had evidence. I lay in bed that night with my back to him, watching the city lights flicker against the window. I kept hearing her voice. "Is this your wife?" Rhea wore my perfume. I didn't realize until I passed her by the elevator the next morning, her coat draped over her arm, her eyes steady, like we were two women staying at the same hotel for very different reasons. Neil had gone ahead to check on the breakfast setup, but I already knew he wasn't in the restaurant. Rhea didn't flinch when she saw me. She smiled faintly and said, "Nice room, huh?" Her voice was casual, dry, not apologetic, like I was the one who'd walked into her life, not the other way around. Breakfast was a performance. Neil scrolled through his phone with the same blank look he used at staff meetings, ordered for me without asking, leaned in when the waiter came by to make sure the bill went to his room. "You feeling better today?" he asked, spreading jam onto toast like nothing had cracked. "Sure," I said, drinking coffee that tasted like metal. Great view. I watched the mirrored elevator doors from where we sat, waiting to see if Rhea would come down, wondering if Neil would blink when she did. He never turned around, but his jaw tensed when the elevator chimed. That afternoon, we walked the streets of Lisbon like tourists who were also pretending to be lovers. He pointed out buildings, offered trivia, laughed too quickly when I mentioned a gallery he once said was boring, and I watched his eyes flick toward every passing woman with long blonde hair. I asked him how long it had been, not loud, just soft enough that it landed like fog. He said, "What are you talking about?" So fast it sounded rehearsed. "You and Rhea," I said. "How many trips?" He blinked once, then said, "She's a consultant. We travel. That's it." We walked in silence after that, not angry, just empty. A busker played guitar by the waterfront, a soft cover of something old and sad, and Neil reached for my hand like it would make me forget. I let him, for a minute, because pretending was easier than talking. We got back to the hotel just after sunset, and there was a card slipped under the door. Handwritten, feminine, delicate script. "Thanks for the upgrade, Mr. Monroe. She's lovely. Best R." He picked it up quickly, crumpled it, flushed it down the toilet like it hadn't happened. That night I took a bath, not to relax but to think. My skin felt tight, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I looked at the robe hanging on the hook and remembered I had one just like it at home, part of a set Neil gave me last Christmas. Rhea had been at that dinner. She gave us champagne. She called me classy and winked at Neil. I asked him later if she was flirting, and he laughed. "She's like that with everyone," he said, pulling me into him, kissing my shoulder like nothing was missing. Back home, I found her scarf on the back seat of his car, folded neatly like it lived there. I held it to my face out of instinct, and the perfume was the same, warm, floral, too familiar now. I asked him about it while we sat in traffic, red light glowing across his cheek, and he didn't answer. He said, "You're being paranoid," then turned up the radio. I didn't bring it up again. I just started watching more closely. When he said he had meetings, I checked the flight tracker. When he traveled for strategy sessions, I looked at the hotel bills. I stopped asking. I started keeping receipts, screenshots, timestamps, anything that proved I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't collecting them for revenge. I just needed to remember the truth. Rhea showed up in all of it, on calendars he said were private, tagged in group photos where she always stood just slightly too close. In one, he was holding a champagne glass in one hand and her waist in the other. His wedding ring was off. That was 2 days before our 10th anniversary. We spent that night in silence, watching a movie neither of us liked, the space between us cold and wide. The last photo that broke me wasn't even of them together. It was of Rhea, alone in a hotel mirror, same dress I once wore, same room we stayed in 2 summers ago. The caption read, "Some upgrades are worth waiting for." I never showed it to Neil. I didn't need to. The truth had already stopped being something he could deny, and I had stopped being someone who needed his version of it. I just watched. I kept walking. I waited until the next flight, where everything would finally break. The front door stuck like always, same uneven swelling from last year's rain, same handle Neil promised to fix when summer ended, but never did. I stepped inside and everything looked exactly the same, keys in the ceramic bowl, mail stacked by the stairs, a faint trace of his cologne hanging in the hallway like memory. He came in behind me, dropped his suitcase too close to mine, and said, "It's good to be home," like that word still meant the same thing to both of us. I walked past him, straight into the kitchen, because it was easier than answering. The fridge hummed, steady and loud, the kind of silence that fills a house when two people have nothing left to say. I poured a glass of water, watched the stream blur against the rim, and listened to him moving upstairs, his steps familiar, his pace unchanged. I stayed in the kitchen for too long, fingers curled around the glass, eyes fixed on the backsplash I always hated. When I finally followed him, I saw his clothes already draped over the armchair, his phone face down on the nightstand, screen still lit from the message I wasn't supposed to see. I picked it up without thinking, thumb hovered just enough to wake it, and there she was, Rhea, her name framed in that same pink heart sticker he once used for me. Her last message read, "Call me once she falls asleep. I miss your mouth." I put the phone back exactly where I found it, slid under the covers without saying anything, and let him lie down beside me like it was still his right. He didn't touch me, didn't speak, just pulled the blanket over his chest and stared at the ceiling like it held answers we never found. The next morning, I made eggs the way he liked them, yolk soft, toast barely browned, and set the table like I always did, hoping it would feel like something. He walked in rubbing his eyes, kissed my forehead, and said, "Smells like before," and I almost laughed, because it didn't smell like before, it smelled like pretending. We ate in silence, forks scraping gently, his phone buzzing twice. Both times he ignored it. I watched the muscles twitch in his cheek, the way he chewed slower when he was calculating something. I asked if he was seeing her. He said, "Who?" I didn't ask again, because when someone lies that easily, the answer is already known. Instead, I started paying attention to small things, how often he stayed late, how his shirts smelled different, how our bed stayed cold even when he claimed he came home early. He started leaving his laptop open, tabs still loaded with booking sites, private browsers, flights with no luggage. I printed the receipts. Not to fight, just to keep. I called his assistant one afternoon, voice casual, pretending to confirm something for an event. She hesitated, then said, "I thought you were going with him this time." That week, I watched him pack 2 suitcases, both his size, one slightly smaller, one missing the luggage tag I always tied on with ribbon. I asked if he needed help. He smiled, distracted, said, "Just for the conference," like it explained everything. I walked to the closet, pulled out the winter coat he never wore, and inside the pocket, found a receipt for dinner at the same hotel we stayed in the night we conceived our son, a reservation under her name. The date matching the night he told me he had a migraine and slept on the couch. I stopped cooking. I stopped folding his laundry. I stopped answering when he asked if I needed anything from the store. He didn't notice for weeks. When he did, he brought home flowers, cheap ones, wilted at the edges, wrapped in thin plastic. I didn't take them. I left them on the counter, watched them rot beside the fruit bowl we used to fill together. At night, I started sleeping in the guest room, told him it was his snoring, blamed it on my back, anything but the truth. He never followed. He never knocked. He just let me drift away. I watched him pack again in April, same suitcase, same cologne, same lie. He left at 4 a.m. Kissed my temple like a reflex, whispered, "Love you," and I pretended to sleep. I waited until the Uber pulled away, then walked into the bathroom, turned on the tap, and stared at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was older than I remembered, tired around the eyes, but steady. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just started folding the receipts, one by one, into neat squares, stacking them into a shoebox labeled "Truth," sealed with quiet hands. Clara recognized me before I saw her, her hair shorter, tied back in a clean knot, uniform pressed tighter than last time, like she'd been promoted, or maybe just learned to look stronger. I was at the coffee cart in Terminal D, waiting for a cappuccino, scrolling through emails I didn't care about, when she tapped my elbow gently, just 2 fingers. "You flew with us in February," she said, not as a question, more like a confirmation. I nodded, unsure what she wanted. "He was with her then too," she added quietly, eyes soft, as if I'd already heard it before. We sat in the lounge, two women who shouldn't know each other, sipping cheap espresso from tiny porcelain cups, pretending this was normal. She didn't ask if I was okay, which I appreciated. She just started talking like we were already in the middle of something. They always board early, she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. She calls him N. He calls her Re, like it's a game only they understand. I listened, watching her hands more than her mouth, noticing the way they trembled slightly, like this cost her something too. I saw them on 4 flights before I realized he wasn't just a bad husband, she said, leaning closer. He was rehearsed. She told me how he'd check in under a company card, how Rhea would board separately sometimes, how Neil would adjust his wedding band right before takeoff, twist it around until it faced the seat aisle, not her. Clara once asked if they wanted to switch meals, and Rhea laughed, said, "We always share anyway," like it was their ritual, a thing they practiced between cities. That was the moment she knew, Clara said, that I wasn't just absent, I was erased. Clara didn't have proof, but she remembered things, dates, destinations, seat assignments. She wrote them down on a napkin, torn from the dispenser, ink smudged from her palm. I watched as she folded it once, twice, then slid it across the table like a contract. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said, glancing around the lounge, "but I've seen too many women get blamed for knowing the truth too late." I took the napkin, read the scrawl, saw 3 cities I didn't know he'd visited, 2 flight numbers that matched ones he said had been rerouted, and the word honeymoon underlined twice. Back home, I opened his laptop while he was in the shower, typed one of the flight numbers into his calendar. It was buried under a meeting label, flagged in gray. The location matched the hotel on the napkin, the one Clara circled. I stared at the entry, then opened the photos folder, fingers slow, breath shallow. I found one from that trip, Neil in a robe, glass in hand, smiling at someone just out of frame. His expression wasn't guilty, it was familiar, like he had nothing to hide, because he didn't think he needed to. I closed the laptop before he stepped out. He asked if I wanted Thai that night, said I'd seemed tired lately, asked if I was sleeping okay. I watched him pour wine with steady hands, the same hands that cupped my face on our wedding day, the same hands that typed her name while I made dinner. "You've been quiet," he said, not accusatory, just curious, like I was a mood he hadn't measured yet. "Just work," I replied, smiling over my glass. He didn't press, just kissed the top of my head and turned on the TV. I watched the reflection in the screen more than the show. 2 days later, Clara sent me a screenshot. Boarding confirmation, both names, and new destination. She'd circled the departure date. It was the same weekend as my mother's memorial. He told me he couldn't come because of a client emergency. I stared at the date for a long time, tried to remember if I had cried about him missing it, or if I'd just told myself it was normal. I texted Clara, "Thank you." She replied, "You deserve someone who doesn't need curtains to love you." I didn't answer. I just stared at the napkin again, folded it tighter, and slipped it into my bag. That weekend, I packed a bag, told Neil I was going to a wellness retreat upstate, watched him nod and ask if I needed gas money, kissed him goodbye like I always did, soft and brief. Then I drove to the airport. I didn't check in. I waited near the gate. I watched them board. Same routine. She laughed at something. He touched her lower back. They walked like a couple who had done this too many times to hesitate. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just watched the boarding door close, the light turn red, and the world keep turning. The hotel was small, tucked between a bakery and a pharmacy, the kind of place tourists pass without noticing. I checked in under my maiden name, used the ID I hadn't pulled from my drawer in years, let the receptionist hand me the key without any idea who I was to her. The room was clean, plain, one window facing the courtyard. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, watched my phone buzz on the nightstand. Neil's name flashed twice, then again, and then nothing. I didn't pick up. There wasn't anything left to explain. Morning was quiet, cool light filtering through the curtains. I walked to the cafe across the street, ordered black coffee, no sugar, sat near the back where I could watch without being seen. Clara texted once, just a photo, Neil at another gate, same duffel, same grin, holding Ria's passport while she adjusted her heels. They looked rehearsed, practiced in the way couples get when they think no one's watching. I stared at the screen a long time, then closed it, slid the phone into my coat pocket, and focused on the hum of conversation around me, the sound of cups being set down. Back home, I unlocked the door slowly, walked through the living room like it might look different now. It didn't. His jacket was still on the hook, his shoes lined neatly beside mine. I left the lights off, dropped my bag on the couch, and stood in the kitchen tracing the counter with my fingers. I opened the fridge, stared at the shelves, then closed it without taking anything. I walked upstairs, opened the bedroom door, then the closet. His suits still hung in color order, pressed and ready, like he was still planning for me to believe in him. I took down the shoebox, the one labeled Truth, carried it to the dining table, emptied it in slow motion. Receipts, screenshots, photos, the napkin Clara gave me, all laid out like puzzle pieces I no longer needed to put together. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just looked at everything we used to be, everything he erased one flight at a time. I packed it all into a mailing envelope, addressed it to him at his office, left it beside the door. Then I took a breath so deep it hurt, then one that didn't. When he got home 2 nights later, he smelled like hotel soap and complimentary gin, kissed me on the cheek, told me he brought back chocolates. "You would have loved the view," he said, unpacking with the ease of someone returning to routine. I nodded, watched him move through the house like it still belonged to him. "Did you go anywhere?" he asked, sipping water, opening the fridge, shutting it again. "Just somewhere quiet," I said, wiping down the counter, needed air. He didn't ask more. He never did. He just nodded, like he believed it, or wanted to. 3 weeks later, he left for another trip, same suitcase, same playlist playing low in the hallway while he zipped it shut. "Back Sunday," he said, checking his watch, then kissed my forehead and walked out the door. I waited until his car pulled away, then opened the browser on his tablet, checked the boarding pass. He was flying alone this time. Ria's name wasn't there. In her place, another one, newer, younger maybe, initials I didn't recognize. I closed the tab, deleted the history, and stared at my reflection in the dark screen, one that no longer flinched. That night, I booked my own flight, a one-way ticket with no return, no seat preference, no companion. I didn't text anyone, didn't leave a note, just packed the bare things, a sweater, passport, keys, and slipped out the door before the sun came up. The air felt cold against my skin, fresh in a way it hadn't for months. I walked to the station, boarded the train, leaned against the window as the city blurred past. I didn't know where I was going exactly, just that it wouldn't have curtains, or rows, or a man waiting in to be.